the outset, I would like to, thank uh, University of Kerala and University of, and then what's called the Institute of Space uh, for arranging this webinar, national webinar. I'm always wary of being identified, described as an expert. Not, I don't really feel very happy about it, and I have not really been trained as an anthropologist who have been studying tribes, and this is my personal journey. Someone who has taken it up and I found interesting, and so I have carried on with this work. And therefore, I myself are learning. I'm not really. There are so many issues with respect to tribal communities on which I'm really ignorant, and have worked a little bit of it, yes, but still it is a journey, and I always, I just said that I am always a little feel wary when some people describe me as an expert on the tribal issues. Uh, I don't know because how competent I am to talk on the COVID, because this is something on which we don't know much about, as to what actually is happening, because I have not been in the field, I have not seen, I have not talked with NGOs and people who have been at the grassroots level. So it is very, very difficult for me to make observations on the COVID and the tribal communities. And therefore, rather than touching on that topic, I will try to locate this whole issues which are being discussed, namely COVID-19 and vulnerability, adaptation, and capacity building in the larger context of, let's say, tribes and the whole idea of the vulnerability. So I will just try to look at in a very broad perspective, and within which I feel that maybe one can talk about some of the issues which concerns the tribal communities, including the issue of the COVID. As it has already been mentioned earlier by Prof. Chancellor as well as Honorary Director, and the COVID-19 has devastated all of us. I think it has devastated the nation, devastated the people, devastated the community, the life. And I think there no one has been spared. So everyone has been impacted. So we have been witness to it, as well as we have experienced what is COVID-19 has really meant for us in the last 1 year or so, and it is still continuing. And this being very unusual, I think a lot of academicians, researchers, research scholars, civil society organizations, NGOs, in fact, they have interested in trying to understand as to how do we really look at the people or the community at the backdrop of this COVID-19. And therefore, I think a lot of webinar has been organized by different organizations and including universities and so on and so forth, like the one which we're already having it. And so it's important, and we do know that as was being talked about in terms of the concept paper, we do know that any epidemic or any major event that really takes place impacts differently to different people. So one could really talk about in terms of as to how COVID, for example, impacted, let's say, layers of people or community or the populations, how it's impacted, let's say, the informal sector, how it impacted the industry, how it impacted the working class. And if one of them also, of course, happens to be a tribal communities, because they are also one on the margins of the society. So while we try to look at the bearing of the COVID with respect to different kind of segment of the populations, and then here we generally try to find it out as to what really happens to the people who are on the margins of the society. And I think tribal communities are one of those who are really at the margin. And therefore, I think this seminar is very pertinent, very important. And I'm sure there's a lot of interesting things will really come up out of the deliberations. But as I said, that I would like to just take this whole idea of the vulnerability and adaptation in the wider context. How do we really look? What is the lens from which we really would like to look at this vulnerability and the adaptability? And with keeping tribal communities in focus. Now, I think we have always seen tribal communities as someone who is really vulnerable, because the very idea of a tribe, in fact, gives us an idea as to how we think of them. Thinking of tribes, thinking about them itself to some extent is indicative of the way in which we look at. And since the 16th century, you find that when Europeans have been moving around different parts, colonizing, and therefore they identified certain segment of the people who they thought were at a very lower stage of development, and this idea of tribe really comes in. So tribe basically is associated with this idea of uncivilized, the idea of being a primitive. And therefore, being a primitive, being an uncivilized, they really live at the lowest level of living, lowest level of development. So that itself, in a way, associated with the idea of the vulnerability. So what we really find is that when we talk about tribes, we primarily try to look at the vulnerability from the socio-cultural perspective. And therefore, the socio-cultural perspective is the one in terms of the way, the image that we have of people who are uncivilized. And therefore, being uncivilized, therefore, they will really be unable to cope up with a disaster or unable to cope up with the situations that the world really confronts. So this whole idea of a tribe, and therefore the uncivilized, or I just said primitive, or to be more refined word would be backwardness. This is something I think in terms of we generally try to look at the vulnerability. Of course, there are different indicators, but I think by and large, this conceptions of a tribe itself makes that there are people who are really vulnerable. I think, and this needs to really be examined a little more carefully. Are they really, just virtue of the fact that they are called uncivilized, are they really vulnerable in terms of dealing with the social reality? In fact, if you really look at tribal communities, they are no longer homogeneous, but by and large, we can generalize that they are intricately related with two important factors of production, namely the land and the forest. I don't know whether we can really think of them outside of the land and forest. Yes, with the post-independent India's development, there are people who are getting educated and they're moving out. But what is really the size of the people who have really moved out? So you find large chunk of people are actually dependent on land and forest. And again, to make a dichotomy land and forest, I think it's always a problematic, because you take any tribal community, they are dependent on both land and forest. So even a community which is well settled, particularly if you go to Jharkhand area, whether you Chhattisgarh or you go to Odisha or what is called Jharkhand, you find that people are really settled. They are settled agriculturists. Yet you find that almost 50 to 60% of their food basket actually comes from the forest. So that is the kind of the situation. So you cannot really just think they are agriculturists. They are also very much dependent on the forest. And most of the studies, including the ones which have come from the Northeast, they point out to almost 50 to 60% of the food actually comes from the forest. And therefore, even settled. So if you really talk about shifting agriculture, which is fairly widespread in the case of Northeast, although you find that this shifting agriculture cycle is becoming smaller and smaller. But nevertheless, you find when you are engaged in shifting agriculture, you find that there is land, a forest, and which is for time being reclaimed and cultivated, and then they wait for, once the fertility is gone, they go back on the. So you find that then they're hunting and food gathering. So any tribal community, you will find that historically at least, you find that they made their living with a combination of modes of life. They didn't really depend on one single livelihood. They were always living on the combinations of the modes of livelihood. So they were hunters, yes, but then they were also forest, what's called for, gathering. So gathering of the produce, etc., was very important. Or you find when settled agriculture, they are doing agriculture, they were doing hunting, they were food gathering. Even when settled, you find agriculture is there, but what is called the hunting and forest gathering and fishing and all that. These all. So you find that there is a combinations of the livelihood that you really find, and therefore they are not really dependent on one single mode of livelihood. And because of this combinations of livelihood, you find that the tribal communities never excessively exploit any natural resources. So they will never exploit the forest to a maximum, or you're aligned to the maximum, because they are making their living in terms of what nature gives and as to how they can best utilize it in terms of their own existence. So that in a way, the very mode of living to some extent you find makes their what is called the living sustainable, because they are not over exploiting any resources. They are all dependent, extracting foods, etc. So this is, I think, is an important way of looking at it. And therefore, when we talk about the tribal communities, particularly, as I said, hunters and food gatherers or shifting cultivators, generally there's a tendency that, they have constantly been living in a very precarious life. Now, I think even anthropologists' initial phases, I think they have been thinking about is that since they are in forests and they have been constantly in struggle for land, what is called for livelihood, for hunting and all that. But recent studies by anthropologists, I've read a couple of them, point out that that is no longer the case. In fact, is being argued that the hunters and food gatherers, in fact, they make their living, their daily survival within just 2 to 3 hours. And even if they have not been able to do hunting, they are dependent on the bee honeys and the bees and the forest resources, and they live. So they say that they are constantly fighting for their survival and livelihood. They have enormous, what is called the leisure time. So this is the recent studies which have been pointing out as to how the tribal communities who have been hunting and food gathering are able to make their living even within the just 3 or 4 hours of the time, and then they have a plenty of spare time. Unlike the kind of conceptions we have that they're constantly struggling for existence and survival. So this is, I think, is an important way to think about the tribals when we are really talking about the vulnerability and all that kind of situations. Now, even in case of in India, you find that if you look at historicize it, and I think there is a book by Anup Maharatna, it is on the demography of India's tribes, and I found it fascinating. In fact, they pointed out that from almost 1871 to almost 1931, whereas there was a decline of the populations of the Indian society, there was almost to a certain percent. You find that there was increase in the fertility of the tribal population between 1871 to almost 1931. So how do you really explain that whereas a society which seems to be more civilized, in fact, they are losing population, but the society which was considered to be, let's say, primitive, in fact, they had a better fertility rate between those periods. And if at all they died, then of course the epidemic was there. But then we're talking about stretch of almost 4 decades where they have sown. And they say it is largely, yes, fertility was there. And there was also a low mortality as compared to the rest of the population. So you said, how do you really explain? And they explained it that primarily it is because of kind of environment in which tribals live. They had open what is called the forest, the cleaner environment, the clean water. They have what is called the forest was there as a food, land was there, and therefore this kind of a living actually gave them a more healthy life than the kind of life which was there. And that's why they argue that there was a better fertility rate and better fertility as well as the lower mortality, and therefore the populations of the tribal communities grew, whereas the populations of the rest of India actually declined. Now, this is the kind of situation, these all studies indicate. Therefore, we have to really look at a little fresh in terms of trying to think of the tribal communities, let's say, somewhat from different kind of lens. Now, therefore, I think we have to historicize, and therefore the kind of vulnerability that they suffered at that particular point of time, we may think they are very vulnerable, but then most of the studies are thinking that they were most adept in terms of coping with the social reality. But today you find the vulnerability is very different. And I think today, if you really find, again, you have to look at the vulnerability in terms of land and forest. And land, we all know that in almost states, the tribals are increasingly losing control over land, forest, and other kinds of resources. It began during colonial period, and if you really want to look at the history of what really happened to the tribal land which was owned, then you have to go to Jharkhand, you have to go to Odisha and really see what really happened during the 19th century and early 20th century. It is in that context that you find revolts and rebellions, as well as you find as early as, let's say, in 1908, the British were forced to introduce what's called Foreign Land Tenancy Act. So, so you find increasingly land was moving away from the tribals to non-tribals. And this was not that they went to a jungle and reclaimed it. They were taking away the land which tribals were already cultivating it. And this was done by fraud, by forgery, by indebtedness, giving them loan, advance, and charging exorbitant rate of interest, and then take away the land. Because tribals didn't have a tradition of reading and writing and record keeping. So they had no record keeping. And the colonial state, in fact, introduced this modern bookkeeping, recording, and all that. And in the process, you find as to how they really lost control over the land. So, and then this has really gone on. Post-independent India, we did introduce what is called protective land legislation. I think almost all states, not only fifth schedule areas or the sixth schedule, but also you find that states which don't have in the fifth schedule have introduced what is called land legislations as to how to restrict the alienation of land from tribals to non-tribals. As well as some states have also, in a way, enacted law to restore the land which have been alienated. But we all know that this has to some extent has been alienated. If you look at the government records of the rural ministry, rural development ministry, you will find that still large chunk of lands are there. So that is one, that is from the tribals to non-tribals. Then government itself is taking away the land by notifications, etc. So this is what is happening with respect to land. But it's also happening with respect to forest. And I think there will be a lot of discussion. I'm sure the forest is an example. That just 1 minute. The telephone. So even the forest, which where has unrestricted access to forest in terms of life and livelihood, as to how the coming of the colonial rule, this also started moving away from their control, from their management. So the forest department, the management of the forest by the colonial state, and then subsequently you find that they introduce the what's called Forest Act, classifying the forest in terms of reserved forest, protected forest. And once you are reserved and protected forest, naturally the access to forest by the tribal communities gets curtailed. So you find that if you look at in terms of what was really happening, even with respect to the forest, you find that as to how they were really being pushed out from the access to land and forest. And this became even worse in the post-independent India. Forest policy of 1952, if you really look at, you look the Wildlife Sanctuary Act, or you look the Forest Conservation Act, you really take it, or you take even other kinds of acts, and all these had a very devastating consequence on the tribal communities. In other words, the access to land and forests, or the life support system to which they had easy access, in fact, they went on losing control over it. And so much so that you find around 2003, 2004, you find large number of forest dwellers where by the Supreme Court order were really being evicted. And it is when you find that various tribal organizations, Campaign for Survival Dignity, under the banner of Campaign for Survival Dignity, they came and, they started this process of as to how to safeguard the interests of this eviction. And that is where the Forest Rights Act really comes in. probably one of the most revolutionary act, radical act that we have as far as the tribal communities are concerned. So what I'm really trying to say is that the whole history, the whole political economy of India, not only during colonial period, but also in the post-independent India, much more, has been such that tribal people have been completely thrown out of their life support system. So from it is there in the sphere of civil society. It has been done through the what is called the government in terms of notification, and most importantly through the mineral exploitations, dams, irrigations, industries, and so on and so forth. So if you really look at the tribal community today, you find that there's a lot of landlessness. Otherwise, one could not have thought of tribals as landless, because if they were in land forest, then you find that land and forest was there. So there was no conception of being a landless anyone. But today you find that large chunk of people have turned into being a landlessness. So you may find maybe 30 or 40, maybe it may vary from the state to state, but I think almost at the national level, I don't exactly know, but it is somewhere around 30 to 33% of the tribal communities to date are turned to be landless. And you find large chunk of them are marginal farmers, and then the smaller farmers. So what you really find is that how do they really manage in this kind of situations? So what I'm trying to say is that we have to really therefore problematize this vulnerability. Vulnerability that has been, that to which they have been exposed today is of a very different order than the kind of vulnerability that they were exposed, let's say, in the earlier phase of their life. Today, they have become uprooted. They have become thrown away from the land. They don't have assets. Their life is much more precarious. And in these kind of situations, if really the epidemic comes, then naturally they are really very vulnerable. But in order to understand the tribal communities and the vulnerability, you have to historicize. And I think, to my mind, if you really historicize, then probably one can really get a better understanding of what actually is really happening. So on the one hand, you find that things that they possessed, the things to which they had access, is being expropriated by either the larger populations or by the state in the name of national development, the growth, or in terms of state development. On the other hand, you find that they have not adequately addressed their everyday problem of maybe educations, of employment, of livelihood, and most importantly, the health. Kerala might be a relatively better place as compared to the others. But if you really go, you find that there's a lot of shortfall of primary health center. There's a lot of shortfall of sub-center or community health center. So you find that even health, which was, as I said, was better during the colonial period because of their access to land and resources, education was not there because they didn't have tradition of reading and writing. But what they had a land and forest, they had good health, and therefore nutritious food and all that. This is precisely has become a problem because of the political economy through which the India is passing through. So what do you find that whereas you have taken away, you have plundered their resource life support system, on the other hand, you have not been really able to supplement, you have not been able to compensate it through, let's say, providing a better health facilities or better economic opportunities and so on and so forth. So even if you look at the health, you find that today malnourished children is a maximum among the tribal children. Stunted, if you really find it, is a maximum among the tribals. So how this malnourishment has come about, whereas it was not there earlier. So there has been some process has been going on which has led to their malnourishment. And even if you find that by and large among the tribal communities, the infant mortality is low. Child mortality is a little bit low, but under 5 mortality, when they actually have to go away from the mother's milk, you find that under 5 mortality, then you find under 5 mortality is very high. You check it. Infant mortality is better than many of the caste groups. And then under 5 mortality, was called child mortality, there is a deterioration. And then under 5 mortality, you find mortality is really very high. So that only shows that as to how, because of the lack of food or malnutrition, what is called the people are getting malnourished, and that is where you find mortality really comes in. So all these things that we talk has come about, malnourishment, mortality, etc., is actually is a result of the kind of process that has really happened, and the state has not really adequately addressed it. So it's not only in terms of shortfall of medical facilities that you find. You can look at it, health status and health status. And then you have also created a new problem because of the mineral exploitations, dams, etc. You have polluted the water. Mineral exploitations have completely polluted the air. And you have sponge industries or steel industries. They have been what is called polluting the land, the grazing field, everything. And therefore you find that in the process, you find there are also there's a new kind of disease that they are becoming succumb to. So what I'm really trying to point it out is that there is this process which we need to understand the vulnerability of the way in which you think about, let's say, is something problematic, and probably you have to think about the vulnerability from a new lens, from a new perspective, and then you have to find out a new way of looking at the situations. I think that is what I think is an important. Unfortunately, what you find that India as a whole always thought of tribal or taking any what is called the perspective on development has primarily been thought about in terms of their socio-cultural life. In the sense, the onus is with the tribals because it is their culture, it is the social customs which actually hindrance to their development. And therefore, only way in which they can develop is by integrating them. So as early as what's called 40s, you find that this whole process of keep them isolations and assimilation that has really gone. Then India always thought about let's take a middle path and integrating. But what is integration actually means? Integration is again a problem. We don't even know. As a sociologist, we have never tried to conceptualize what integration really means. Integration means, well, probably people may be able to preserve something and then also become a part of it. But that is not the case. The way in which we are actually doing is not integration. It is more often assimilating them. And so you find that the whole ethos of looking at tribal community is that you bring the whole idea of the mainstream. I always find I'm not able to understand what is this really mainstream that we talk about it. The moment you talk about the mainstream, you're basically saying that, well, they must really be, they must dissolve themselves and completely get absorbed into the larger Indian society. So I think these are the issues which are there. So what we really find is that we have thought that the more you integrate, integration has always been thought as the solution of the tribal problem. So they always think you integrate them and then you will resolve the problem. But the history shows for the last 100 or more than that, post-independent India, you have tried to integrate them, but then you have not been able to solve the problem. Integration has not led to the problem. Or what is the assimilation or whatever agenda you think, how do you concept, how sociologists really conceptualize, that is, you have to look at. Whether you talk about integrations, you are talking about assimilation. But whether you talk of integration or assimilations, which Indian state has been talking about the tribal communities, has not led to resolution of their problem. Their problem have become aggravated. It become worse. So integration is not a panacea of the tribal problem, of the way in which India has been carrying on. And I think the best example, I'll just conclude with that. Look at the Northeast. Northeast people have still access to their land, their forest. Much of their land and forest is with the community, with the lineage, with the individuals. It is not even the forest. You find that it's not with the state. It is with the community, it is with the lineage, even individual forest, and only a small patch of forest you will find that it is under the state. So they have, although you find that Northeast India had been struggling, or there had been self-determination movement and there was security state, but the land and forest did not move away from the control of the tribal communities to the outsiders or to the state because that didn't really happen. Whereas in the rest of the India, peninsular India, we always thought of developing them. So it was more of a developmental state in the mainland India. And that very developmental state has not led to development. So if you look at the Northeast, which was security state, and the developmental dimension is coming only of late, probably most it is a 1990s phenomena or post 1990s phenomena, or maybe even 21st century phenomena. But for the long period of time, they have been struggle. And despite that struggle, you find that quality of life, quality of development indicators is much, 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 much better than the tribal communities elsewhere who have been subjected to a development model of the Indian state. So that is where the paradox is. So it only says that probably the development and vulnerability can be overcome if they have still a control over land and forest and resources, which is the case in the Northeast. They have not really lost, and yet you find development indicators are very good. Whereas rest of India, it was a developmental state since the 1950s, but developmental state has led to the worsening of the situations with tribal communities. You just check it. The more tribal regions have got integrated with the state, worse is the scenario. You go to Odisha, you go to Jharkhand, you go to Chhattisgarh. Look at people living below poverty line. Look at the health status. Look at the people under mortality. So Kerala is there, but then the kind of development experience which, let's say, fifth scheduled areas, particularly Jharkhand, etc., Kerala has not really gone through it. And Kerala, of course, I'm not saying. So you find relatively it's better. But so point that I'm trying to make it is that the vulnerability that we are talking about, in the context of which the COVID has to be understood, the vulnerability itself has to be problematized and looked at from a different lens. Let's not really look at vulnerability in terms of the fact of being lowest stage of development or primitive and savage, etc., etc. But I think look at the vulnerability more in terms of what the state has done and in terms of dispossessions and displacement through which tribal communities, either through the state actions or through the actions of the movement of the people from the plains, has and adversely impacted. That is what we have to really look at. And it is in that context that I feel that the COVID and its impact on the tribal communities has to be seen. So I'll just wind it up here. This is just a kind of very lens from which I thought I should really look at it. But as I said, I have not done any work on COVID, and not that I am an expert on health, but some ideas I thought might be useful in terms of problematizing the issues which you are going to deliberate in the next 4 days. So thank you very much for your invitation.